A couple vanished without a trace after their wedding in 1985, leaving behind nothing but questions and heartbreak. Their mysterious disappearance would haunt their families for over a decade, until the terrible truth finally emerged. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. June 15th, 1985, dawned bright and clear over Willow Creek, Texas, as if the heavens themselves were blessing the union about to take place. By noon, the small town was buzzing with excitement, pickup trucks and family sedans lining the streets near the white-steepled church where generations of locals had exchanged their vows. Today was special, though. Sarah Thompson and David Miller were getting married, two of Willow Creek's most beloved children joining their lives together. Sarah looked radiant in her mother's restored wedding dress, delicate lace cascading down her slender frame as she clutched a bouquet of wild jasmine and bluebonnets. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned beneath a simple veil, her blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears of joy. David stood tall at the altar, his usually oil-stained hands scrubbed clean, his dark hair neatly combed back. The local mechanic had never looked more handsome, his broad shoulders filling out the rented tuxedo that Mrs. Gable had helped him select. "And never seen two people more meant for each other," whispered old Mr. Jenkins to his wife, as Sarah floated down the aisle on her father's arm. The church was packed to the rafters, every pew filled with friends, family, and neighbors who had watched these two grow from children playing tag in dusty streets to the adults they'd become. The reception at the community hall was everything a small-town celebration should be. Paper streamers hung from the ceiling fans, spinning lazy circles in the summer heat. Mismatched tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes. Mrs. Thompson's famous peach cobbler, Sheriff Carter's smoked brisket, and enough casseroles to feed an army. The local band, comprised mostly of high school teachers and the town's dentist, played everything from Patsy Cline to the latest radio hits. As evening fell, strings of fairy lights twinkled to life around the dance floor. David spun Sarah in graceful circles, her laughter ringing out clear as a bell over the music. They looked into each other's eyes as if they were the only two people in the universe, oblivious to the fond smiles and happy tears surrounding them. To Sarah and David toasted Thomas Miller, David's father, his voice thick with emotion. "May your love story be the greatest this town has ever known." No one noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass, or the shadow that passed briefly across his weathered face. As midnight approached, guests began drifting away, tossing rice and well-wishes at the beaming couple. The newlyweds waved from David's blue Ford Fairlane, decorated with tin cans and "Just Married" painted across the back window, before driving off toward the lake cabin they'd rented for their honeymoon. Behind them, Willow Creek grew quiet, the celebration fading into the warm Texas night. An unnatural stillness settled over the town, as if the very air was holding its breath. Something about that silence made the hairs on the back of Sheriff Carter's neck stand up, the kind of hush that makes even the bravest souls shiver. The morning after the wedding dawned with an unusual stillness over Willow Creek. The sun rose as it always did, casting long shadows across Main Street. But something felt different. By 9 o'clock, when David hadn't shown up to open the garage where he worked as the town's most trusted mechanic, his boss, Frank, started checking his watch every few minutes. David was never late, not in the 5 years he'd worked there. Probably just sleeping in, Frank told himself with a knowing smile, wedding night and all. Over at Blooming Hearts, the flower shop where Sarah had worked since high school, Nancy kept glancing at the door. Sarah was supposed to come in for a half day before leaving for their honeymoon. Her cheerful voice and infectious laugh typically filled the small shop by 8:30 sharp. "Young love," Mrs. Peterson said with a wink as she picked up her weekly arrangement. "Remember when we couldn't bear to be apart, Howard?" Her husband nodded, though his eyes held a flicker of something, concern, perhaps. By noon, the whispers had started. Casual comments about the newlyweds taking an extra day morphed into speculation about a surprise getaway. Martha from the diner suggested they might have driven straight to the coast after the reception. "They deserve it," she said, refilling coffee cups. "Such a beautiful couple." But as the afternoon wore on, the first tendrils of worry began to take root. Emma Gable, who ran the town's only grocery store, stopped by the garage with a concerned frown creasing her forehead. "But, Frank, did David pick up his keychain?" she asked, her voice tight. "He left it on my counter yesterday morning when he came for donuts. Said it was his lucky charm. Wouldn't get married without it nearby." Frank's smile faltered. He never mentioned it. By 4 o'clock, calls to their home went unanswered. Sarah's mother tried the honeymoon cabin by the lake, but no one picked up there either. "They would have called," she insisted to Sheriff Carter, her hands twisting her handkerchief into knots. "Sarah always calls." Little things began to stand out in sharp relief. The missed morning shift, the half-packed suitcase Sarah had shown her bridesmaids, the dinner reservation at the lake restaurant, still in the books but never claimed, David's truck, still parked behind the community hall where the reception had been held. Each detail on its own might mean nothing, a change of plans, a forgotten obligation. But together, they formed something more ominous. Like individual threads being woven together, they created a tapestry of unease that settled over Willow Creek as the sun began to set on what should have been the first full day of the Millers' married life. What started as mild concern quickly transformed into full-blown panic as the hours stretched into days with no sign of Sarah and David. The townspeople of Willow Creek had gone from cheerful well-wishers to worried neighbors in the span of 48 hours. The newlyweds' absence loomed larger with each passing moment, especially when Sheriff Ben Carter confirmed what many had begun to fear. Something was terribly wrong. "Their luggage is still at the cabin," Sheriff Carter announced to the growing crowd outside his office on that third morning. "Clothes unpacked. Wedding gifts unopened." He didn't mention the champagne bottle still chilling in its bucket, now surrounded by melted ice, a detail that haunted him. The only clue was a hastily scribbled note in Sarah's familiar handwriting. "Back soon. Don't worry." 5 words that raised more questions than they answered. The paper had been left on the kitchen counter, weighted down by Sarah's wedding ring, a detail that sent her mother, Eleanor Thompson, into hysterics when she learned of it. Sarah would never remove that ring, Eleanor insisted, her voice breaking, not after waiting so long to wear it. Sheriff Carter tried his best to project calm confidence. "We're following every lead," he assured the townspeople, though his eyes, ringed with exhaustion, betrayed his growing concern. Ben had known both Sarah and David since they were children. This wasn't like them at all. By the 4th day, nearly half the town had volunteered for search parties. They fanned out across Willow Creek's dusty roads and sprawling cotton fields, calling the couple's names until their voices grew hoarse. Farmers abandoned their tractors, shopkeepers closed early, and even old Mrs. Jenkins, who needed a cane to walk, insisted on joining the search. "Sarah, David." Their calls echoed across the Texas landscape, answered only by the hot summer wind rustling through the trees. Frank Miller, David's uncle, organized teams to check abandoned buildings and old hunting cabins. "My nephew wouldn't just vanish," he insisted, though doubt had begun to creep into his voice. "There's got to be an explanation." As twilight fell on the 5th day, Sheriff Carter stood at the edge of Lake Morrison, watching as the search boats made one final sweep before darkness set in. The reflection of their flashlights danced across the water's surface like desperate, searching spirits. "We'll find them," Deputy Lewis said, standing beside him. Carter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. 20 years as sheriff had taught him to recognize the difference between a simple disappearance and something more sinister. The note, the abandoned luggage, the missing car but present belongings, it all pointed to a story far darker than anyone in Willow Creek was ready to face. The search for Sarah and David intensified as the third day dawned over Willow Creek. Sheriff Ben Carter organized teams to comb through the honeymoon cabin again, this time with forensic precision. It was Deputy Marlene Jenkins who found it first. A dark stain beneath the colorful rug by the fireplace. Small, no bigger than a playing card, but unmistakably blood. Could be anything, Carter said, kneeling to examine it. Animal, maybe, or a cooking accident. But the tightness in his jaw betrayed his concern. The stain had been deliberately covered. The rug's position, slightly off-center from the rest of the room's arrangement. The forensic team from the county arrived by noon, their equipment transforming the rustic cabin into something clinical and strange. They photographed the stain, took samples, and searched for more evidence of struggle or violence. The cabin yielded little else, just 2 untouched glasses of wine on the nightstand, a half-packed suitcase, and the eerie stillness of plans interrupted. "Sheriff, you need to see this," called Linda Pearson, Sarah's assistant at the flower shop. She'd been gathering Sarah's personal items when she discovered an old leather-bound diary tucked beneath the counter register. Sarah wrote in this almost every day. The last entry was the morning of the wedding. Carter flipped through the pages, his expression darkening as he reached the final entries. Sarah's normally neat handwriting had grown jagged and rushed. The last 3 pages contained fragments that made his blood run cold. He called again. Says, "Time's up. David doesn't know everything. Can't tell him now. Not before the wedding. Secrets have a way of finding daylight. Old debts. A promise I can't break." The final line, underlined 3 times. "If anything happens, look for the blue box." Carter closed the diary, his mind racing. What debts? What promise? And what blue box? He instructed Linda to keep the diary's contents confidential, but in a town like Willow Creek, secrets traveled faster than light. By evening, whispers of blood and secrets snaked through every diner booth and front porch. The diary's existence became public knowledge, though its contents remained speculative. Some claimed Sarah had been hiding a terminal illness. Others suggested David had gambling debts. The wildest rumors painted them as fugitives from justice. Their wedding a clever cover for escape. Sheriff Carter watched the speculation spread like wildfire, knowing each theory pulled the town further from whatever truth lay buried. The diary's cryptic warnings and the hidden bloodstain transformed what might have been a simple disappearance into something far more sinister. A mystery that seemed to have begun long before the wedding bells rang. The whispers started at Mabel's diner, where the morning coffee crowd gathered to exchange theories. Willow Creek had always been a town where everyone knew everyone's business, but the disappearance of the Millers had transformed casual gossip into something darker, more urgent. "I saw him with my own eyes," Pete Wilson insisted, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Tall fella, city clothes, arguing with David outside the garage. Never seen David look so rattled before. Pete leaned forward, lowering his voice. The stranger had these eyes, cold as January steel. When he noticed me watching, felt like my blood turned to ice. Other witnesses emerged with their own fragments of the puzzle. Elaine from the post office recalled the man's black sedan with out-of-state plates. Parked it behind the garage, like he didn't want to be noticed. That was 3 days before the wedding. Sheriff Carter collected these accounts methodically, but each new detail only deepened the mystery. The stranger had appeared and vanished like a ghost, leaving only unease in his wake. Then Linda Parker, who worked at the beauty salon where Sarah had her wedding hair done, shared something that sent a chill through the town. Sarah got a call that morning, right before her appointment. Her face went white as a sheet. She stepped outside to talk, but I heard her say, "You promised to leave us alone." When she came back in, She tried to smile, but her hands were shaking so bad I had to help her sit down. The salon's story spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. At the church potluck, in the aisles of Gable's grocery, across backyard fences, everywhere, people whispered their theories. Some believed the newlyweds had fled from danger. Others wondered if they'd been hiding secrets all along. Maybe they owed money, suggested Frank at the hardware store. David did renovate that house mighty quick last year. Or maybe they witnessed something they shouldn't have, countered his wife. Remember those break-ins over in Riverdale? The unity that had brought the town together for the search began to fracture. Suspicion crept in where sympathy had once flourished. People who had known Sarah and David their whole lives now questioned every interaction, reinterpreting smiles and casual comments through a lens of doubt. Sheriff Carter watched it happen with growing concern. A town divided couldn't help find the missing couple. And worse, if Sarah and David had chosen to disappear, they might never want to be found. But if they were victims, as the bloodstain and diary suggested, then time was running out. The question hung in the air, like the summer humidity. Had the Millers fled from something terrible, or had something terrible found them first? Arthur Jenkins wasn't the type of man who sought attention. Living on the outskirts of Willow Creek, he preferred the company of his crops and the occasional conversation with his border collie, Max. So when he shuffled into the sheriff's office 3 days after the disappearance, had clutched in weathered hands, Sheriff Carter knew it was important. "I wasn't going to say nothing," Arthur mumbled, eyes fixed on the floor. "Figured it weren't my business. But them being missing and all." The old farmer described how he'd been checking his irrigation system near midnight when he spotted the Millers' distinctive blue Ford Fairlane. The car had been moving at a steady pace, headlights cutting through the darkness, heading away from town on the old State Line Road, the opposite direction from their honeymoon cabin by the lake. "You sure it was their car?" Sheriff Carter pressed, leaning forward in his chair. "There are lots of blue Fords around these parts. Had them white ribbons still tied to the antenna," Arthur insisted. "Wedding decorations, you know. And that dent on the rear fender from when David backed into the post office sign last spring." This new information sent ripples through the investigation. If Arthur was right, the couple had deliberately changed course. But why? The State Line Road led to nothing but abandoned farms and eventually crossed into Oklahoma. Hardly a romantic destination for newlyweds. Sheriff Carter dispatched deputies to canvass the route, questioning gas station attendants and motel owners along the way. None remembered seeing the Millers or their car. Back in town, the questions multiplied like wildfire. If they'd planned to leave, why abandon their packed luggage at the cabin? Why would Sarah leave that cryptic note? "Back soon." Don't worry, if they were fleeing, it made no sense. Theories sprouted faster than Mrs. Thompson's prize petunias. Some believed the couple had secret debts and were running from collectors. Others whispered about cold feet. Perhaps David or Sarah had panicked about married life. The most troubling theory came from Willow Creek's resident gossip, Edith Palmer, who suggested that one of them might have had a hidden lover waiting beyond the state line. "But I always thought it strange how that girl would get those long-distance calls at the flower shop," Edith remarked loudly at the diner, ensuring everyone heard. She'd take them in the back room, away from curious ears. Arthur's testimony should have clarified things, but instead it only muddied the waters. Every answer spawned 3 new questions, and the truth seemed to slip further away with each passing day. The Millers had vanished into the night, leaving behind everything but questions that hung in the air like the summer heat, oppressive, inescapable, and offering no relief. Sheriff Carter cornered Arthur Jenkins at the Rusty Nail, the only bar in Willow Creek where locals gathered to escape the summer heat. The old farmer sat hunched over his 3rd whiskey, his weathered hands trembling slightly as the sheriff approached. "Your story keeps changing, Arthur," Carter said, sliding onto the adjacent bar stool. "At first you said you saw them at 11:30. Then midnight. Now you're saying it was closer to 1 in the morning. Arthur's rheumy eyes darted around the room. My memory ain't what it used to be, Ben. You know that. This isn't about forgetting where you left your reading glasses. 2 people are missing. The farmer took another sip. Liquid courage for what came next. Look, I saw what I saw. That blue Ford heading north on County Line Road, not toward the lake cabin. David was driving. Sarah was in the passenger seat. They weren't smiling like newlyweds should. Sheriff Carter leaned closer. Was someone else in the car with them? Arthur's hesitation lasted 3 heartbeats too long. I don't rightly know. It was dark. Meanwhile, Deputy Simmons was reviewing the security footage from the camera outside Mrs. Gable's grocery store, the only surveillance in their small town. The ancient VHS system had been Mrs. Gable's response to a string of candy thefts the previous summer. Now it might hold the only clues to the Miller's disappearance. "Sheriff, you need to see this," Simmons called when Carter returned to the station. The grainy black-and-white footage showed Main Street in its usual nighttime stillness. Cars passed occasionally. Then, at 11:15, the Miller's Ford appeared at the edge of frame, moving slowly. The timestamp jumped suddenly from 11:17 to 11:43, nearly 30 minutes missing. "Could be a malfunction," Simmons offered. "These old systems record over themselves sometimes." Carter shook his head. "Check the other nights." They reviewed footage from the previous week. No other gaps. "Someone tampered with it," Carter concluded, the weight of this realization settling heavily between his shoulder blades. Word spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. The missing footage transformed what might have been a voluntary disappearance into something sinister. Parents began walking their children to school. Doors that had remained unlocked for generations now clicked shut at night. Mrs. Thompson stopped sleeping altogether, convinced that every sound in her empty house was Sarah returning. Thomas Miller drank himself into oblivion each night, the guilt of whatever he knew or suspected, eating him alive. The uncertainty bred fear, and fear bred monsters in the imagination of every resident. Each passing day without answers stretched nerves thinner. What had happened during those missing 30 minutes? Who had erased them? And why? Hope, that fragile thing the town had clung to, began to wither under the shadow of dread. 6 months after Sarah and David's disappearance, Willow Creek was no longer the tight-knit community it had once been. The town that had come together in search parties now gathered in fragmented groups, each with their own theory about what had happened to the newlyweds. At the diner, conversations would hush when Sheriff Carter walked in, only to resume in fervent whispers once he left. "They planned it all along," Martha Jenkins would say over her morning coffee. Young people these days want adventure, not small-town life. They're probably on a beach in Mexico, laughing at us all. Her certainty was comforting to some who preferred to imagine the couple happy and alive somewhere exotic. Others, like old Frank Wilson who ran the hardware store, had darker suspicions. That boy was into something bad. I saw it in his eyes weeks before the wedding, nervous-like, always looking over his shoulder. Frank's words carried weight. He'd known 3 generations of Millers and claimed he could read them like open books. The division grew deeper as summer turned to fall, and fall gave way to a bitter winter. Neighbors who had once shared Sunday dinners now crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations. The annual Christmas festival, usually a highlight of the year, was a subdued affair with half the usual attendance. Meanwhile, Eleanor Thompson, Sarah's mother, retreated into a world of obsession. Her living room walls became covered with pages from Sarah's diary, newspaper clippings, and photographs connected by red string. She fixated on the cryptic entries about debts and promises, reading them over and over until the pages grew thin from handling. "My daughter wasn't afraid of anything," she told anyone who would listen. But something scared her in those final weeks. something to do with David. Eleanor recalled a day, 3 weeks before the wedding, when she'd stopped by David's garage unexpectedly. She'd found him in heated conversation with a tall stranger in an expensive suit, a man who didn't belong in Willow Creek. When David noticed her, he'd abruptly ended the conversation, introducing the man simply as a parts supplier, before quickly ushering him out. David's hands were shaking. Eleanor told Sheriff Carter during one of his follow-up visits, and after that day, he started asking Sarah about her savings, about whether they could postpone the honeymoon. Money troubles, I thought at first, but now... Her voice trailed off as she pointed to a diary entry where Sarah had written, "Dee says it's nothing to worry about, just an old family matter. But I see the fear in his eyes when the phone rings." The town's fracture lines deepened with each passing day, and the mystery of the Millers threatened to permanently destroy the community that had once celebrated their love. Sheriff Carter sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of yellowed files and faded photographs. 3 months had passed since the Millers vanished, and the case had consumed him. The diary entries about debts and promises kept him awake at night, pointing to something buried in the past. He pulled out Thomas Miller's file, a name he'd never expected to investigate. Thomas had been Willow Creek's auto shop owner for 30 years before passing the business to David, respected, hard-working, ordinary. Or so everyone thought. "I found something," Deputy Ross said, placing a manila folder on the desk. "County records from 1972. Thomas Miller took out 3 loans from Coastal Finance Group in Houston." Carter flipped through the documents, his stomach tightening. Coastal Finance was a front for the Delgado crime family. They dressed like bankers, but broke kneecaps like professionals. The records showed Thomas falling behind on payments, then mysteriously catching up with a lump sum. No formal charges were ever filed, but police reports from that period mentioned Thomas as a person of interest in a series of auto thefts across county lines. "Thomas paid his debt," Carter murmured. "But at what cost?" The next morning, Carter visited Thomas at his small house on the edge of town. The man who answered looked 20 years older than his 65 years, shoulders hunched beneath an invisible weight. "I always feared this day would come," Thomas said, hands trembling around a coffee cup. "I thought it was over. I swear I thought it was over." Thomas confessed to modifying stolen vehicles for the Delgados decades ago. Just 3 cars, he insisted. To clear his debt after a failed business venture left him desperate. He'd walked away, rebuilt his life, and never spoke of it again. "Did David know about this?" Carter asked. "No," Thomas whispered. "God, no. I protected him from all of it." But as Carter dug deeper, he discovered that several of the Delgado associates had recently been released from prison. One had been spotted in a neighboring county just weeks before the wedding. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. The Miller name, once synonymous with honest work and community service, became tainted by whispers and sideways glances. Longtime customers stopped bringing their cars to the garage. Friends crossed the street to avoid conversations. Mrs. Thompson, Sarah's mother, confronted Thomas outside the grocery store, her grief transforming into rage. "What did you bring down on them?" she screamed as neighbors watched in stunned silence. Could the sins of a father have doomed his son? The question hung over the town like storm clouds, dark and heavy, refusing to break. Sheriff Carter felt the pressure building, not just to solve a disappearance, but to prevent the complete unraveling of Willow Creek itself. A breakthrough in the case came nearly 6 months after the disappearance, when Detective James Morgan from the county sheriff's office uncovered prison release records that sent a chill through Willow Creek. Silas Blackwood, a notorious loan shark with connections across 3 states, had been released from Huntsville State Penitentiary just 3 weeks before Sarah and David's wedding. The timing couldn't be coincidental. "And this man doesn't forget," Detective Morgan explained to Sheriff Carter as they reviewed the file. "He's been known to track down debtors years after they thought they were in the clear." Blackwood's criminal history painted a disturbing picture. He'd built his reputation on patience and brutality, breaking fingers before breaking lives. What made him particularly dangerous was his methodical approach. Unlike typical loan sharks who relied on quick violence, Blackwood preferred psychological torment, often targeting family members to extract payment. Sheriff Carter spread the photos across his desk, mugshots showing a tall man with dark hair swept back from a high forehead, eyes that seemed to pierce through the camera with calculating coldness. When he showed the photos to Mrs. Gable, her face drained of color. "That's him," she whispered, fingers trembling as she pointed to Blackwood's image. "That's the man I saw arguing with David outside the garage. Same height, same cold eyes, like looking at a snake." She described how the stranger had leaned in close to David, speaking words that made the young mechanic's shoulders slump in defeat. The connection to Thomas Miller's past suddenly crystallized. What had seemed like a mysterious disappearance now revealed itself as something far more sinister, a debt collection spanning generations. "Thomas always said the past was settled," Sheriff Carter muttered, pinning Blackwood's photo to the investigation board. "Looks like the past had other ideas." The town's perception shifted overnight. Whispers of elopement or cold feet gave way to darker theories. People began recalling other details. How David had seemed distracted in the weeks before the wedding, checking over his shoulder more than usual. How Sarah had mentioned to a friend that David was worried about family business he couldn't discuss. Detective Morgan established a timeline. Blackwood's release, his arrival in Willow Creek approximately 1 week before the wedding, and the couple's disappearance immediately after. The pattern matched Blackwood's known methods, allowing victims to experience a moment of happiness before tearing it away. "This isn't a local mystery anymore," Sheriff Carter told the assembled search volunteers. "We're dealing with organized crime." He paused, the weight of realization heavy in his voice. "And if Blackwood has them, every minute counts." What had begun as a small-town tragedy was now revealed as a single thread in a much larger, darker tapestry, one woven with old vendettas, unpaid debts, and the long shadow of a criminal who never forgot a name. The call came in at dawn. Officer Jenkins, patrolling the Eastern County line, spotted tire tracks veering sharply off the road and disappearing into Blackwater Woods. What he found changed everything. The blue Ford Fairlane lay crumpled against an ancient oak, its hood crushed like paper, abandoned for what looked like weeks. But it wasn't the wreckage that made Jenkins radio Sheriff Carter with a voice that cracked mid-sentence. "Ben, you need to get out here now." By noon, the scene crawled with investigators. They photographed the car from every angle, documenting the shattered windshield and the driver's side door hanging open like a broken jaw. Sheriff Carter stood apart from the others, his weathered face set in grim lines as he turned a small golden object over in his palm. Sarah's childhood locket, the one her grandmother had given her on her 16th birthday, found wedged beneath the passenger seat. "That's hers, Mrs." Thompson whispered when shown the locket, her fingers trembling as she traced the delicate engraving. She never took it off, not even to shower. But it was what they found in the trunk that silenced even the most hardened officers. A length of white fabric, torn and stained with rusty brown patches. The lab would later confirm what everyone already knew. The blood belonged to Sarah Miller. The fabric matched the custom lace of her wedding dress, handmade by her Aunt Ellie. They didn't run," Sheriff Carter announced at the emergency town meeting that evening, his voice echoing through the stunned silence of the community hall. "They were taken, and we're treating this as a kidnapping. Possibly worse." The woods that had once seemed peaceful now loomed ominous around Willow Creek. Children were kept indoors. Hunting parties ventured out with flashlights and shotguns, searching for any sign of the missing couple. But the forest yielded nothing more than shadows and whispers. Hope, which had sustained the town for months, began to flicker like a candle in the wind. Some still clung to the possibility that Sarah and David might be found alive, but most began the painful process of accepting a darker truth. The evidence painted a violent picture that nobody wanted to see. "I should have known," Thomas Miller confessed to Sheriff Carter after 3 sleepless nights. "When David asked about my old troubles last spring, I should have known Silas would come back. I just never thought he'd hurt them." The discovery transformed Willow Creek overnight. Doors that once stood open were now locked tight. Neighbors eyed strangers with suspicion. The woods, once a place of childhood adventures and lovers' walks, became a forbidden zone, its trees standing sentinel over secrets too terrible to imagine. Thomas Miller sat in the sheriff's office, his weathered hands trembling as he clutched a paper cup of cold coffee. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting every line etched by years of worry. Sheriff Carter leaned against his desk, arms crossed, waiting for the truth that had taken 12 years to surface. "I should have told you everything from the beginning," Thomas finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is all my fault. All of it." The confessions spilled out like poison from an old wound. Back in '78, Thomas had borrowed $30,000 from Silas Blackwood to save his failing business. He'd paid most of it back, but interest had ballooned the debt to impossible heights. When Thomas couldn't pay, Silas disappeared, locked up for another crime, and Thomas thought he was free. Then, 3 weeks before David's wedding, Silas showed up at my door, Thomas said, tears welling in his eyes. Said prison gave him plenty of time to remember who owed him, said the debt had grown to $70,000 with interest. Sheriff Carter's jaw tightened. "And you dragged David into this?" Thomas nodded, shame radiating from him in waves. "I begged David to help. Just one job," I told him. Silas needed someone with mechanical skills to modify some cars, remove VIN numbers, install hidden compartments. David refused at first. "But Silas," Thomas's voice broke. "Silas threatened Sarah's family too, said he'd burn down the flower shop with her mother inside." The sheriff scribbled notes, connecting pieces of a puzzle 12 years in the making. "So David agreed. He thought he could do this one job, pay off my debt, and be done with it," Thomas continued. "The plan was to slip away after the wedding reception, do the work that night, and be back before anyone noticed. Sarah insisted on going with him, said they were a team now." Evidence from the investigation suddenly made terrible sense. The hasty note, the abandoned luggage, the car seen heading in the wrong direction. "But it was a trap," Sheriff Carter said, realization dawning in his eyes. Thomas nodded, tears now streaming freely. Silas never intended to let them go. One job became another, then another, when they tried to escape. He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of his confession seemed to physically crush Thomas, his shoulders collapsing inward as he buried his face in his hands. "I killed them both," he sobbed. "My son and his bride. I might as well have pulled the trigger myself." Sheriff Carter stared at the wall map of Willow Creek, red pins marking search locations from years past. The truth was finally emerging. But it offered no comfort, only confirmation that Sarah and David had been pawns in a game they never chose to play, forced into a darkness from which they couldn't escape. The news of Thomas Miller's confession spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, transforming the town's collective grief into something far more volatile. What had been hushed conversations in kitchens and on porches now erupted into public confrontations. Sarah's mother, Eleanor Thompson, her face gaunt from sleepless nights, cornered Thomas outside the general store 3 days after his confession to Sheriff Carter. "Hugh!" she screamed, her finger jabbing the air between them. "You killed them both! Your debts, your secrets, you sacrificed my daughter for your sins!" Onlookers froze as Eleanor's voice cracked with rage. Thomas stood motionless, shoulders slumped, accepting each verbal blow as penance. "I never meant," he began, But Eleanor wasn't finished. 12 years I've waited for answers. 12 years while you walked these streets knowing what you'd done. She clutched her handbag where Sarah's diary lay hidden, her lifeline to her missing daughter. Their blood is on your hands, Thomas Miller, every drop. The confrontation shattered what remained of Willow Creek's unity. Families who had shared Sunday dinners for generations now chose sides. The Hendersons, who had been fishing buddies with Thomas for 20 years, crossed the street to avoid him. The quilting circle that had embraced Eleanor since the disappearance now fractured when Mabel Jenkins suggested Thomas deserved some compassion. Compassion, Martha Wilkins had retorted, slamming down her needle. That man let his own son walk into a trap. There's no forgiveness for that. At night, Eleanor would sit at her kitchen table, the diary open before her. The pages had grown soft from constant handling, the ink fading where her tears had fallen. She traced Sarah's handwriting with trembling fingers, lingering on the entries from the weeks before the wedding. He knows about the money. The calls won't stop. She read aloud to the empty room, and then the most haunting line. He knows. Now David knows too. Eleanor had memorized every word, searching for clues she might have missed. What had Sarah known? What terrible secret had she carried to her wedding day? The diary offered fragments but never the whole truth, like pieces of a puzzle, scattered by a cruel wind. Thomas retreated to his house on the edge of town, windows shuttered against accusatory stares. His phone rang only with anonymous threats. Once, a brick shattered his living room window with a note attached. Where is she buried? The weight of suspicion crushed decades-old friendships. Pastor Mitchell's sermon on forgiveness fell on deaf ears as half the congregation stared daggers at Thomas in the back pew. Eleanor sat across the aisle, clutching the diary like scripture, her grief hardening into something unrecognizable, a monument to all that had been stolen from her. The lead on Silas Blackwood's operation came through an anonymous tip called into the sheriff's office 3 months after the discovery in the woods. A nervous voice mentioned an old chop shop 15 miles outside Houston, where Silas conducted special business. Sheriff Carter and 2 state detectives arrived at dawn, the morning dew still clinging to the tall grass surrounding the dilapidated warehouse. The building sat isolated among overgrown fields, its corrugated metal walls rusted and peeling. A padlock hung broken on the front door. Someone had been here recently. Carter drew his weapon. Signaling the detectives to cover the rear exit, the air felt heavy with foreboding as they pushed the creaking door open. The smell hit them first, metallic and putrid. Carter's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing concrete floors stained with oil and something darker. Tools were scattered everywhere, along with car parts and empty beer cans. In the center of the room lay a body, face down in a congealed pool of blood. "Jesus Christ," whispered Detective Morales. Covering his nose with his sleeve, they approached cautiously, weapons raised. The corpse belonged to a large man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, Ray Donovan, one of Silas's known enforcers. His skull had been crushed, likely with the blood-covered wrench lying nearby. The medical examiner would later determine he'd been dead for approximately 48 hours. "Looks like someone fought back," Carter observed, scanning the room for other signs of struggle. Overturned tables and scattered tools told a story of desperation and violence. In the back corner, they discovered a makeshift office. Papers were strewn across a metal desk, many soaked through with spilled coffee. Among them, Carter found vehicle identification numbers, falsified titles, and shipping manifests to Mexico, but it was what he found in the bottom drawer that made his blood run cold. A scrap of white fabric, delicate lace edging stained with dried blood. The material matched Sarah Miller's wedding dress perfectly. "They were here," Carter said, his voice barely audible. He bagged the evidence with trembling hands. Detective Morales discovered more. a woman's earring behind a workbench, one that Mrs. Thompson later identified as Sarah's, and a single shell casing from a 9mm pistol. The walls seemed to whisper with echoes of terror. As forensic teams combed through the building, the gravity of what they faced settled over Carter like a shroud. This wasn't just about finding missing newlyweds anymore. The blood, the body, the evidence of struggle. They were chasing something far darker. "We're not looking for answers anymore," he told Morales as they watched technicians photograph Donovan's body. "We're trying to survive whatever truth we find." That night, Carter couldn't wash away the stench that clung to his clothes and skin, the overwhelming smell of fear and loss that permeated the chop shop. Whatever happened there had changed the trajectory of their search forever. Hidden beneath layers of dust and motor oil, Detective Morris uncovered a rusted red toolbox tucked behind a false panel in the chop shop's back room. The metal container held secrets that would finally connect the scattered pieces of the Miller disappearance. Inside, nestled among worn wrenches and screwdrivers, lay David's engraved keychain, the one Mrs. Gable had mentioned he never parted with. The silver horseshoe, with DM etched in flowing script, was unmistakable, its presence here confirming their worst fears. "Look at this," Morris called to Sheriff Carter, carefully unfolding a set of yellowed mechanical diagrams. The detailed plans showed modifications for various high-end vehicles, alterations to engine compartments, hidden storage spaces, and tampered VIN numbers. David's distinctive handwriting filled the margins with calculations and notes. "He wasn't just fixing cars," Carter muttered, tracing the diagrams with his weathered finger. Silas was forcing him to modify stolen vehicles. These compartments here, perfect for running drugs across county lines. The forensics team discovered something else. Blood spatter patterns on the shop floor that had been hastily cleaned but still revealed their story under specialized lighting. Analysis confirmed it matched Sarah's type. Scattered nearby were torn fabric scraps that the lab would later confirm came from her wedding dress. "She must have found him here," theorized Agent Lawson from the State Bureau. "The evidence suggests she tracked David down and attempted to help him escape." A partial fingerprint on the toolbox matched Sarah's left index finger. Her lipstick was found on a discarded coffee cup, dated just 3 weeks after their disappearance. She had been alive, searching for her husband while everyone believed they'd vanished together. The most damning evidence came from a voice recorder hidden in the office area. Though damaged, technicians recovered fragments of conversation. David's voice, strained but recognizable, pleading, "Just let her go, Silas. I've done everything you asked." Another recording captured sounds of struggle, a woman's defiant shout, undoubtedly Sarah, followed by the sickening crack of impact and Silas cursing. The timestamp showed this confrontation occurred 4 months after the wedding. For the townspeople of Willow Creek, these discoveries blurred every assumption they'd made. David wasn't a willing accomplice, but a prisoner. Sarah hadn't abandoned her life, but had desperately tried to save her husband. Yet questions remained. How much had David known before the wedding? Had he tried to escape his father's legacy only to be pulled back in? The line between victim and unwilling participant grew increasingly thin. As Sheriff Carter stared at the blood patterns photographed on the shop floor, he wondered if they'd ever know the full truth of what happened in those desperate moments when Sarah confronted her husband's captors, and what terrible price she might have paid for her courage. The cabin stood like a rotting tooth in the mouth of the wilderness, miles from any paved road or friendly light. Sheriff Ben Carter wiped sweat from his brow as he and State Detective Reeves approached through the thick underbrush. 12 years of searching had led to this moment, 12 years of dead ends, false hopes, and a town slowly poisoned by uncertainty. Movement inside, Reeves whispered, his hand hovering over his holster. The windows were covered with filthy sheets, but a shadow passed behind one torn corner. The door splintered under their combined weight. The stench hit them first. Blood, urine, and despair, so thick it seemed to have physical form. In the dim light, they saw Silas Blackwood sprawled in a wooden chair, clutching his abdomen where crimson spread across his dirty shirt. "Took you long enough," Silas wheezed, a ghastly smile revealing yellowed teeth. "He's over there." Sheriff Carter's flashlight beam cut through the darkness to the far corner. The sight froze his blood. David Miller, or what remained of him, lay on a filthy cot, one wrist chained to a rusted pipe. His once strong frame had withered to skin stretched over bone. His beard was matted, his eyes sunken into hollow sockets. "David?" Carter approached slowly, as one might a wounded animal. "David, it's Ben Carter from Willow Creek." David's eyes flickered with recognition, then fear. "Sarah!" The word emerged as a croak from his parched throat. "We'll find her," Carter promised, though the lie tasted bitter. He unlocked the chain with trembling hands while Reeves called for backup and medical support. He tried to run yesterday," Silas coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Shot me when I caught him, not enough strength to finish the job." David had been Silas's prisoner all these years, forced to modify stolen vehicles in makeshift garages across 3 counties. Whenever authorities got close, Silas would move them, always dangling Sarah's safety as the reason for David's cooperation. "Where is she?" Carter demanded, looming over the bleeding loan shark. Silas merely laughed. The sound like gravel in a blender. "Insurance policy!" As paramedics loaded David into the ambulance, Carter caught a glimpse of the man's eyes, windows to a soul that had endured countless nights of torment, of not knowing if his wife lived or died, of hope slowly bleeding away with each passing month. David clutched Carter's sleeve with surprising strength. "He made me call her parents once," he whispered, "to prove I was alive, but he never let me hear her voice. Never." The revelation sent ice through Carter's veins. If Silas had used David as leverage against Sarah too, where had she been all this time? And what horrors had she endured in her own private hell? The truth finally emerged from David's broken whispers in the hospital room. 12 years of silence shattered as he recounted that fateful wedding night to Sheriff Carter, his voice barely audible above the beeping machines. They had never intended to stay at the honeymoon cabin. Sarah had discovered something in Thomas Miller's old papers, evidence of the debt to Silas Blackwood that had never truly been settled. "We were going to drive to Oklahoma," David explained, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the hospital walls. "Start fresh where no one knew us. Sarah said we'd come back when it was safe." They had packed a small bag with essentials, leaving their honeymoon luggage as a decoy. The note, "Back soon, don't worry," was meant to buy them time. But Silas had informants everywhere. As the newlyweds slipped away in their blue Ford Fairlane, 2 black sedans appeared on the country road, forcing them into a ditch. 4 men dragged them from the wreckage. When Sarah fought back, clawing at her captors with desperate strength, a shot rang out in the darkness. "I heard her scream," David said, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "They threw her in one car, me in another. It was the last time I saw her alive." For 12 years, Silas kept David in a living hell, moving him between locations whenever authorities got close. "He showed me Polaroids of Sarah every month," David continued. "Said she was alive in a place I'd never find her. Said if I tried to escape, they'd cut off her fingers one by one and mail them to her mother." So David worked. He modified engines, created hidden compartments for drug smuggling, forged documents. Each task was a promise that Sarah might live another day. He became a ghost himself, existing only to keep her memory alive. The breakthrough came when one of Silas's men got sloppy, using a credit card that triggered an alert. When authorities closed in on the cabin, Silas and David were alone. David had seized his chance, grabbing Silas's own gun during a moment of distraction. The struggle left Silas wounded but still dangerous until Sheriff Carter and the state police arrived. "I never believed she was still alive," David confessed, his voice breaking. "Not after the 3rd year, but I couldn't stop hoping, couldn't risk being wrong." The Polaroids were found in Silas's possession, all staged with the same dress, the same locket, taken years ago. Sarah had likely died that very first night, her body hidden where perhaps it would never be found. As David spoke, Sheriff Carter watched the final pieces of the puzzle lock into place, a truth so cruel it made the 12 years of mystery seem merciful by comparison. David's return to Willow Creek in the autumn of 1997 should have been a moment of celebration, but instead the town received him with a mixture of pity and unease. The ambulance that brought him from the hospital to his childhood home moved slowly down Main Street, as if carrying a fragile artifact rather than a man. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching from a distance, unsure whether to wave or look away. The doctors had done what they could for his physical wounds, the broken fingers that had been forced to work on stolen cars, the cigarette burns that mapped his arms like constellations of pain. But they couldn't heal what had been broken inside him. David's eyes, once bright with ambition and kindness, now stared through people rather than at them, as if he was perpetually looking for something or someone in the distance. The garage where he had once worked with such pride remained shuttered, dust gathering on the tools that had waited 12 years for their owner's return. Twice, well-meaning friends tried to convince him to reopen, suggesting it might help him heal. David would only shake his head, his hands trembling at the mere thought of touching a wrench again. "He doesn't speak much," Thomas Miller told anyone who asked, his voice heavy with the guilt that had aged him 20 years in just over a decade. "Just sits by the window most days, watching the road." The unspoken truth hung in the air. He was watching for Sarah, though everyone knew she would never come. The community that had once embraced the Miller family now crossed the street to avoid Thomas. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed, as if his mistakes were contagious. The Sunday service at Willow Creek Baptist had a noticeable gap in the 3rd pew, where the Millers had always sat. Pastor Wilson had tried to counsel forgiveness, but the wounds were too fresh, the loss too profound. Across town, the flower shop that had once bloomed with Sarah's creativity stood empty, a for sale sign swinging in the breeze. Mrs. Thompson had sold it for less than half its worth. Desperate to escape the memories that haunted every corner, she moved to her sister's home in Arizona, taking only photographs and Sarah's diary, leaving behind even her furniture, as if she could somehow outrun her grief by traveling light. The town doctor prescribed David sleeping pills that he rarely took, preferring instead to keep his vigil by the window. Some nights, neighbors reported hearing his screams, nightmares that echoed through the quiet streets, reminding everyone that while David Miller had been found, he remained forever lost in the darkness of what he had endured. Silas Blackwood sat motionless in the courtroom as the judge handed down his life sentence. His face remained a mask of cold indifference, even as the families of his victims wept openly in the gallery. When asked about Sarah's whereabouts, his thin lips curled into what might have been a smile. The only words he ever offered came during a prison interview with Sheriff Carter, the old well at the farm. Just 5 words that sent search teams scrambling across 3 counties, checking every abandoned property with a well. They drained murky waters, dug through decades of silt, and found nothing but rusted buckets and animal bones. The FBI brought in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to search the perimeter of every well they found. Volunteers from Willow Creek joined the effort, their faces grim with determination. For weeks, the search continued, hope diminishing with each empty well. Mrs. Thompson spent her savings hiring private investigators who promised answers but delivered only theories. She sold her house to fund one last extensive search, convinced that her daughter deserved a proper burial. "I just want to bring her home," she told anyone who would listen. her once bright eyes now permanently ringed with exhaustion. Some believed Silas had lied about the well to torture the town further. Others thought Sarah might still be alive somewhere, unable or unwilling to return. The uncertainty was its own form of cruelty. David, still recovering in a facility 2 counties over, couldn't bear to participate in the searches. The mere mention of wells would send him into trembling fits that lasted for hours. Sarah's absence became a presence in itself. Mrs. Thompson would wake in the night, certain she'd heard her daughter's laughter floating through the hallway. She kept Sarah's perfume bottle on her nightstand, occasionally opening it to catch the faintest hint of jasmine that reminded her of the wedding day. "She visits me in dreams," she confided to Sheriff Carter during one of his check-ins. Always smiling, always in that beautiful dress. The town of Willow Creek changed irrevocably. Neighbors who once left doors unlocked now installed security systems. Parents kept closer watch on their children. The community hall where the wedding reception had been held remained empty for years, as if the space itself were haunted by what came after. At the florist shop, now under new ownership, customers still occasionally requested Sarah's special arrangement, wild jasmine and baby's breath. Just like her bridal bouquet, the new owner always obliged, understanding that in Willow Creek, Sarah wasn't just a victim in a tragedy. She was a reminder that peace, once shattered, might never fully return. 12 years passed, each one carving deeper lines into the faces of Willow Creek's residents. The scars left by Sarah and David's disappearance never truly healed. They simply became part of the town's identity. Like the old water tower or the church bell that rang every Sunday morning, the blue Ford Fairlane was never recovered, though rumors persisted. Some claimed to have spotted it in neighboring counties. Others swore it had been crushed and buried in the desert. The wedding cabin at the edge of town stood empty, its paint peeling and porch sagging, windows reflecting nothing but lost dreams and fading sunsets. No one had the heart to renovate it, and no one dared to demolish it. David lived as a shadow of himself in a small apartment above the hardware store. He never reopened the garage, never married again. His hands, once steady and skilled with engines, now trembled constantly. On rare occasions, locals would see him walking the perimeter of town at dawn, searching for something only he could name. Sarah's mother passed away in the winter of 1997, taking to her grave the hope that her daughter might one day return. The flower shop changed hands 4 times, but no arrangement ever matched the wild beauty of Sarah's bouquets. Her diary remained in a locked drawer at the sheriff's office, its cryptic final entries still haunting those who had read them. Sheriff Carter retired, his hair gone completely white, the case file never officially closed. His replacement, a young woman from the county seat, learned quickly not to ask about the Miller case unless she wanted silence to fall across a room like a heavy curtain. Thomas Miller died alone, ostracized until the end. At his funeral, only David attended, standing motionless as the coffin was lowered, his forgiveness coming too late to heal either of them. Sarah and David's tragedy became Willow Creek's cautionary tale, a legend whispered to teenagers who stayed out too late, a warning about secrets, debts, and the fragile line between happiness and heartbreak. Parents held their children closer. Newlyweds chose different venues for their receptions. The fields of cotton grew tall around the town, year after year, indifferent to human suffering. But every summer, when wild jasmine bloomed and the evening air turned sweet, the wind seemed to carry their story, soft, sorrowful, and unforgettable, of the couple who vanished, and the truth that destroyed not just them, but the innocence of an entire community. Some wounds never heal. Some mysteries are never solved, and some ghosts never rest, especially in a town like Willow Creek, where the past is never truly past, but always waiting, just beneath the surface.